I never thought I would be the kind of person posting on a relationship advice subreddit. Even now, sitting here and typing this, part of me wishes I could go back to being the version of myself who existed 8 months ago. The version who believed his life was finally coming together exactly the way he had always imagined. My wife and I had been married for 4 years. Nothing about our marriage was perfect, but it was solid. At least that's what I believed. We rarely fought. We shared responsibilities. We had routines. Friday takeout, Sunday grocery shopping, long walks after dinner when the weather was good. The kind of ordinary life that feels boring when you're young and desperately exciting once you've spent enough years watching chaos destroy other people. For almost 2 years we had been talking about having children. Not obsessively. Not in a way that put pressure on either of us. It was more like a shared dream sitting quietly in the corner of our lives. Someday, we'd say, when things settle down, when we're ready. Then someday arrived. I still remember the exact moment. I came home from work on a Tuesday evening. The house was unusually quiet. My wife met me near the front door. At first I thought something was wrong. She looked nervous. Her hands were shaking. I asked if everything was okay. Instead of answering, she handed me a small gift bag. I laughed. It wasn't my birthday. It wasn't our anniversary. I asked what it was. She just said, "Open it." Inside was a tiny pair of baby socks. For a second I didn't understand. I stared at them. Then I looked up at her. Then back down. Then up again. The realization hit me so suddenly it felt physical. I remember saying, "No way." Then again, "No way." She started crying before I did. And then somehow we were both crying, laughing, holding each other. I picked her up and spun her around the living room like an idiot. I must have asked if she was serious 15 times. She kept laughing and saying yes. Ness. We were having a baby. I don't know how to explain what that felt like. The world instantly rearranged itself. Every plan I had suddenly extended 20 years into the future. I started imagining birthday parties, school pickups, teaching a kid how to ride a bike, helping with homework, family vacations, Christmas mornings. All those moments you never think about until they're suddenly yours. That night we stayed awake until almost 3 in the morning, talking, planning, dreaming. We discussed names, argued jokingly about nursery colors, wondered whether the baby would have her eyes or mine. At one point she fell asleep on my shoulder while we sat on the couch. I remember looking at her and thinking how lucky I was. I genuinely believed I was looking at the next chapter of my life. Over the following weeks I became completely invested. I downloaded pregnancy apps, read articles, watched videos, learned things I never knew existed. Every week I'd tell her what size the baby supposedly was. A blueberry now, a strawberry, a lime. She would roll her eyes and laugh. Friends started noticing how excited I was. I couldn't help it. I had waited years for this. My father wasn't particularly emotional when I was growing up, but when I told him he was going to be a grandfather, he hugged me so hard I could barely breathe. I still remember that. The look on his face, the pride, the happiness. At the time, I thought it was the beginning of something beautiful. I had no reason not to. No warning signs, no suspicion, no fear, just certainty, absolute certainty. And that's probably why I missed the very first thing that should have bothered me. Because looking back now, there was a moment during those first weeks. A small moment. So small I dismissed it immediately. But it was the first crack in everything. And once I finally understood what it meant, nothing in my life would ever look the same again. Looking back, I spend a lot of time wondering whether I should have noticed sooner. The problem is that when you're happy, your brain becomes surprisingly good at protecting the happiness. You explain things away. You ignore details. You choose the interpretation that keeps your world intact. At least that's what I did. The first few weeks after we learned about the pregnancy were everything I had imagined they would be. We attended appointments, talked about future plans, started quietly setting money aside. Sometimes I'd catch myself smiling for no reason while sitting at work. The thought of becoming a father was constantly in the background. It felt like carrying a secret source of joy everywhere I went. But somewhere beneath all of that, small things started changing. Not dramatic things. Nothing that would make someone immediately think, she's cheating. If anything, each change was so ordinary that it seemed ridiculous to question it. The first thing I noticed was that she became strangely distant whenever I talked too much about the baby. Not all the time. Just enough that I remember it now. At first she had seemed every bit as excited as I was. Then gradually, whenever I brought up names, nursery ideas, or future plans, she would smile politely before changing the subject. I told myself she was overwhelmed. Pregnancy affects everyone differently. That's what every article said. I didn't think much of it. Then there were the conversations. Or rather, the lack of them. Before the pregnancy, my wife and I talked about everything. Not in a movie-style way where couples share every thought, but enough. We communicated. Suddenly, there were topics she seemed reluctant to discuss. I'd ask how she was feeling. She'd say, fine. I ask if she was nervous. She'd say, a little. The conversations felt shorter, less natural, like she was carefully avoiding something I couldn't identify. Again, I blamed stress, pregnancy hormones, thought anything except the possibility that something was actually wrong. Then there was the timeline. This was the detail that would later haunt me. One evening, we were sitting at the kitchen table looking through one of those pregnancy tracking apps. The app estimated how far along she was. Nothing unusual, just routine information. But when she looked at the date estimate, something flashed across her face. A brief expression, confusion, maybe concern. It disappeared almost instantly. I probably wouldn't even remember it if everything that happened later hadn't burned the memory into my brain. What? I asked. That what? You looked surprised. She laughed. I'm not surprised. You just made a face. I didn't. Then she looked back down at her phone. Conversation over. At the time, it seemed insignificant. People make weird expressions all the time, but it stayed with me. Not because it was suspicious, because it felt strangely defensive. Over the next few weeks, I noticed similar moments. Tiny reactions. Questions she didn't want to answer. Subjects she redirected. Comments she ignored. One night I casually asked whether she'd told everyone at work yet. The question seemed harmless. Instead, she became irritated, not furious, just noticeably annoyed. Why does it matter? I was just asking. You ask a lot of questions lately. I remember sitting there confused, because I genuinely hadn't intended anything by it. After a few minutes she apologized, said she'd had a rough day. I accepted the explanation immediately. Why wouldn't I? Marriage requires trust. And I trusted her completely, or at least I thought I did. The strange thing is that none of these moments created suspicion on their own, not even close. They simply created discomfort, a feeling that something was slightly off, like hearing a familiar song played just a fraction of a note out of tune. You can't identify the problem. You only know something doesn't sound right. I pushed the feeling aside. I focused on the excitement, the future, the baby, because the alternative wasn't even a possibility in my mind, at least not yet. Then came the first appointment that genuinely unsettled me, and for the first time, a question entered my head that I immediately hated myself for asking. The appointment itself wasn't dramatic. No shocking revelation, no secret message, no obvious lie. If someone had recorded the entire thing and shown it to 100 different people, 99 of them probably wouldn't have noticed anything unusual, but I did. Or maybe I only noticed because of everything that had already been quietly accumulating in the back of my mind. The appointment was scheduled for a Thursday morning. I took time off work so I could go with her. I had been looking forward to it all week. Every appointment felt important. Every appointment made the pregnancy more real. I remember sitting in the waiting room scrolling through articles about fetal development while she stared at her phone. She seemed nervous. Not excited, nervous. Not first-time parent nervous. A different kind of nervous. Her leg bounced constantly beneath the chair. She barely spoke. I asked if she was okay. She smiled, just tired. That answer was becoming increasingly common. The doctor eventually called us in. Everything started normally. Routine questions, medical history, basic updates. Then the conversation shifted toward estimated conception dates. Nothing unusual. The doctor was simply explaining development measurements and adjusting expectations. I wasn't paying close attention at first. I was too busy staring at the ultrasound screen, watching that tiny shape move, trying to process the fact that this little life actually existed. Then I noticed my wife. She had gone completely still. The doctor mentioned a range of dates. Again, nothing alarming, just medical information. But my wife immediately interrupted. Those dates aren't exact, right? The doctor smiled. No, they're estimates. How accurate are they? A few days either direction is normal. She nodded, then asked another question, and another, and another. By the end of the discussion, she seemed far more interested in the dating estimates than anything else. More interested than I was. At the time, I assumed she was simply anxious. Plenty of expectant mothers worry about details. I didn't think much of it, but the memory stayed with me. Later that night, I casually mentioned it. You seemed really focused on the timeline stuff. The reaction caught me off guard. Immediately defensive. Immediately tense. I was just asking questions. I know. So what's the problem? There isn't a problem. Then why bring it up? I remember staring at her, confused. It felt like we'd somehow ended up in the middle of an argument I hadn't intended to start. Eventually, she apologized. Adam said hormones were making her emotional. Adam. And once again, I accepted it, because that's what supportive husbands do. At least that's what I believe. The next few weeks weren't better. The distance between us became harder to ignore. Physically, she was still there. Emotionally, she felt somewhere else. Sometimes I'd catch her staring into space, lost in thought. When I asked what she was thinking about, she'd say nothing. When I asked if something was wrong, she'd say nothing. When I asked if she was happy about the pregnancy, she'd smile and say yes. But the answer always felt rehearsed, as though she knew what she was supposed to say. One evening, I brought home takeout from her favorite restaurant. A small gesture, the kind of thing I'd done 100 times before. Normally, she'd hug me, thank me, make some joke about pregnancy cravings. Instead, she barely reacted. She seemed distracted, preoccupied, almost guilty. The word appeared in my mind before I could stop it. Guilty. I hated myself for thinking it. Immediately, what kind of husband looks at his pregnant wife and thinks that? I pushed the thought away. But once a thought exists, it becomes difficult to completely erase. A few days later, I met my friend Eric for drinks. I hadn't planned to talk about any of this. I certainly wasn't seeking relationship advice. I was mostly venting about how confusing pregnancy felt, how emotional everything seemed, how disconnected my wife had become. I expected him to reassure me, tell me it was normal. Instead, after listening quietly for several minutes, he asked a question that instantly made me uncomfortable. Have you asked her directly what's bothering her? She says nothing's bothering her. He nodded slowly, then took a sip of his beer, and asked another question, one that stayed in my head long after the conversation ended. What if that's not actually the thing she's hiding? I laughed it off immediately, changed the subject, talked about something else. But that night, lying awake beside my sleeping wife, I couldn't stop hearing those words. Because for the first time, I realized something. I wasn't just worried anymore. I was starting to become suspicious. And once that suspicion appeared, every memory began looking different. I wish I could say there was one specific moment when everything suddenly clicked into place. There wasn't. The truth came together the way a puzzle does when you don't realize you've been assembling it. One piece at a time. A detail here, a memory there, something that doesn't fit. Then eventually you step back and realize the picture forming in front of you is not the one you thought you were building. For me, it started with dates. Just dates. Numbers on a calendar. The kind of thing nobody pays attention to until they have a reason. And unfortunately, I had started looking for reasons. Not because I wanted to, because I couldn't stop. Eric's question had planted something in my head. What if she was hiding something? I kept trying to reject the idea. Every time it appeared, I'd argue with myself. You're being paranoid. She is pregnant. She's stressed. You're overthinking. Normal husbands don't investigate their wives. Normal husbands trust them. But another voice kept responding. Then why does everything feel wrong? One Saturday morning, while my wife was out shopping with her sister, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. I wasn't looking for evidence. At least I don't think I was. I was trying to remember, trying to rebuild a timeline. When had we conceived? How did those dates compare to the doctor's estimates? Initially, I expected everything to line up. I wanted everything to line up. Instead, I found myself growing increasingly uncomfortable. The dates weren't impossible. That was the problem. They were just strange. Close enough to make sense. Far enough to raise questions. Questions I couldn't answer. I started reviewing memories, business trips, weekends, family visits, work schedules. The more I looked, the less confident I became. There had been a period roughly around the estimated conception window when things between us had actually been unusually quiet. We'd both been busy, exhausted, distracted. I remembered it clearly because we'd joked afterward that we'd barely seen each other for 2 weeks. At the time it meant nothing. Now it suddenly seemed important. Maybe too important. I spent hours convincing myself while I was imagining things. Medical estimates aren't exact. Everyone knows that. Pregnancy dating changes. Human memory is imperfect. There were dozens of reasonable explanations. Yet the anxiety kept growing. Then another memory resurfaced. One I'd completely forgotten. A conversation from months earlier, before the pregnancy announcement. Before any of this, my wife had attended a work conference in another city. Just 2 days. Nothing unusual. I remembered because she'd complained endlessly about the travel, the long meetings, the hotel, the exhaustion. At the time, I'd barely thought about it. Now I found myself wondering why that trip had suddenly appeared in my mind. I hated where my thoughts were going. Hated it. Because the second you start connecting dots, you begin seeing patterns everywhere. Most of them are real. I knew that. I knew suspicion could become self-perpetuating. You look for evidence. Then you interpret everything through the lens of what you're afraid might be true. I desperately wanted to avoid becoming that person. The paranoid husband, the jealous husband, the guy who destroys his marriage because he can't control his imagination. So I decided to do something simple. I would talk to her, not accuse, not interrogate, just talk. That evening, while we were eating dinner, I casually brought up the conference. Her reaction was immediate, not dramatic, not explosive, but immediate. Her shoulders tightened, her eyes dropped toward her plate. The shift was subtle enough that most people wouldn't have noticed. Why are you asking about that? He said, no reason. You haven't mentioned that trip in months. I was just remembering stuff. The silence that followed felt strange. Uncomfortable. Then she changed the subject completely and refused to come back to it. The conversation ended there, but the look on her face stayed with me because it wasn't annoyance. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't even defensiveness. It looked like fear. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying the interaction over and over, trying to find a reasonable explanation, trying to convince myself I was creating problems that didn't exist. Then sometime around 3 in the morning, another realization hit me. A realization so unsettling that I physically sat up in bed. Because for the first time, I remembered something about that conference trip that I had completely forgotten. Something small, something innocent by itself. But once I remembered it, I couldn't ignore it. And suddenly the timeline looked even worse than before. The thing I remembered wasn't proof, not even close. If someone else had told me the story, I probably would have dismissed it immediately. That's part of what made the following weeks so miserable. Nothing was concrete. Nothing was undeniable. Everything existed in that awful space between certainty and doubt. The conference had taken place about 3 months before we discovered the pregnancy. At the time, I remembered my wife mentioning a coworker repeatedly, not in a suspicious way, just casually. The way people talk about colleagues after spending several days together. His name had come up enough that I remembered it. Daniel. That was all. A name. Nothing more. But now, lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, I found myself wondering why I remembered him at all. The answer made me uncomfortable, because somewhere in the back of my mind, I'd noticed something back then. Something I hadn't paid attention to. She talked about him more than everyone else. Not dramatically more. Just enough. The kind of detail that feels meaningless until viewed through a different lens. The next morning I hated myself. Genuinely hated myself. I felt like I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. Someone suspicious. Distrustful. For years, I'd believed that trust was a choice. Now I was discovering that trust becomes incredibly difficult when uncertainty starts eating holes in it. I tried focusing on normal life, household responsibilities, preparing for the baby, but every quiet moment became dangerous. My brain immediately returned to the same questions, the same timelines, the same inconsistencies, and worst of all, the same fear. What if I was wrong? What if I destroyed my marriage over nothing? That possibility terrified me almost as much as the alternative. Then my wife started becoming even more distant. Not openly, not obviously, just enough. She spent more time alone, more time on her phone, more time staring into space. When I asked what was wrong, she'd say she was tired. When I asked if she was stressed, she'd say yes. When I asked if she wanted to talk, she'd say no. It felt like living beside someone who was slowly disappearing. One evening, I found her crying in the guest room. The sight shocked me. She immediately wiped her face when she saw me. I sat beside her, asked what happened. She insisted it was nothing. Pregnancy emotions, hormones, stress. The explanation should have made sense. Instead, something about it felt incomplete, like I was hearing only part of the story. I wrapped my arms around her, told her we would get through whatever was bothering her. For a brief moment, she leaned into me. Then she quietly pulled away. That hurt more than I expected. Not because of the rejection, because it felt deliberate, as if accepting comfort from me had suddenly become difficult. After that night, the emotional distance between us became impossible to ignore. The house felt different. Conversations felt different. Even simple interactions carried an underlying tension. And then something happened that pushed me past passive suspicion. Pure accident. Nothing more. A few days later, she left her phone on the kitchen counter while taking a shower. I wasn't trying to snoop. I need to be honest about that. I wasn't searching through her messages. I wasn't checking her accounts. The screen simply lit up. A notification appeared, and I happened to see it. Just one line, one preview, one message. No context, no explanation, just enough to make my stomach drop. The sender's name was Daniel, the same Daniel from the conference. The message itself wasn't romantic, not explicitly, not enough to prove anything, but it wasn't professional either. It read, "Have you told him yet?" That was it. One sentence, 7 words. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, trying to understand. trying to rationalize, trying desperately to find an innocent explanation. Maybe they were discussing work. Maybe they were planning some surprise. Maybe there were 100 reasonable answers. But standing there in that kitchen, I realized something terrifying. For months, I'd been fighting suspicion, trying to suppress it, trying to stay rational, trying to remain the husband who trusted his wife. Now, for the first time, I wasn't just afraid something was wrong. I was afraid I already knew what the answer might be, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face it. I spent the next 48 hours pretending everything was normal. To this day, I don't know how I managed it. I went to work, answered emails, made small talk with coworkers, came home, cooked dinner, asked my wife how she was feeling, did all the things a normal husband was supposed to do. Meanwhile, my mind was collapsing. That message replayed constantly. Have you told him yet? Over and over. Thousands of times. Every possible explanation fought for space in my head. Maybe it was work-related. Maybe Daniel was helping organize something. Maybe it had nothing to do with me. But if that were true, why hadn't she simply mentioned it? Why did it feel like every conversation lately was missing pieces? Why did I feel like the last person being informed about my own life? I barely slept. When I did, I'd wake up an hour later with my heart racing. My appetite disappeared. The future I'd been imagining, birthdays, school pickups, bedtime stories, suddenly felt fragile, like glass. Like one wrong answer could shatter everything. Eventually, I convinced myself that speculation was accomplishing nothing. I needed facts, not assumptions, not theories. Facts. The opportunity came unexpectedly. A week later, my wife asked me to grab something from her home office. She was in the living room and didn't want to climb the stairs. The request itself was ordinary. I walked upstairs, entered the room, looked for the folder she described, and then I saw it. A folded medical document sitting partially underneath a notebook. At first, I wasn't interested. Then I noticed the date. The document appeared to be from one of her earliest prenatal appointments. Earlier than the appointment I'd attended with her. Earlier than I knew existed. That immediately struck me as strange. We had supposedly been experiencing the pregnancy together. Why had there been an appointment she never mentioned? I told myself to leave it alone. I genuinely tried. Then I looked again and saw my wife's name printed at the top. I wish I could claim some moral high ground. I can't. I picked it off. The entire decision took less than a second. What I found wasn't proof of infidelity, but it was the first genuinely objective inconsistency I'd encountered. The gestational estimate listed on the document was different from the one she'd repeatedly discussed with me. Not dramatically different, just enough. Enough to move the probable conception window backward. Enough to create a larger gap between the medical timeline and the timeline I remembered. Enough to make my stomach turn. I stood there staring at the page, reading the numbers repeatedly, hoping I'd misunderstood. But numbers don't change because you want them to. I quietly returned the document exactly where I'd found it, then spent the rest of the afternoon pretending nothing had happened. That evening, I finally asked about the appointment. Casually as I could manage. The reaction was immediate. That same flash of panic I'd begun recognizing. Why are you asking? I found some paperwork upstairs. Her face drained of color, only for a second. Then she recovered. It was nothing. It was just an early visit. So why didn't you tell me? I didn't think it mattered. The answer felt rehearsed. Prepare. Too fast. And for the first time, I didn't accept it. I pressed further, not aggressively, just enough. Her explanations started changing. Small inconsistencies, tiny adjustments, details that didn't quite align. By the end of the conversation, I felt worse than when it started. Not because I'd learned anything definitive, because I realized she was actively avoiding clarity. She wasn't trying to reassure me. She was trying to end the discussion. That distinction mattered a lot. The next day, I called Eric. I told him everything. The timeline issues, the conference, Daniel, the hidden appointment, the changing explanations. There was a long silence when I finished. Then he asked a question I'd been avoiding for weeks. Have you considered a paternity test? The words hit me like a punch. Not because I'd never thought about it. Because I had. Repeatedly. Secretly. I just hadn't allowed myself to say it out loud. Saying it made it real. Saying it transformed suspicion into something tangible. Something measurable. Something that could be confirmed. Or destroyed. That night, after everyone else would have considered the evidence overwhelming, I still sat on the couch trying to convince myself there was another explanation. Some misunderstanding. Some coincidence. Some missing piece. Then my wife walked into the room, sat beside me, and said something that changed everything. Something so unexpected that every remaining rationalization immediately began falling apart. Because for the first time, she admitted she wasn't completely certain about something. And the thing she wasn't certain about was the one thing she absolutely should have been. Even now, months later, I can still hear her voice. Not because she was shouting, not because the conversation became dramatic, because of how quiet she sounded. People imagine life-changing moments as explosions. In reality, some of them arrive as whispers. That night she sat beside me on the couch. Neither of us said anything for almost a minute. The television was on, but neither of us was watching it. I remember hearing the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the ticking of a wall clock, the sound of my own heartbeat. Then she spoke. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. She looked down at her hands. For several seconds, she didn't continue. Then she finally asked, "Have you ever wondered about the dates?" I don't think I'd ever experienced fear like that. Not because of the question itself, because of what it implied. Every explanation I'd been desperately clinging to suddenly felt weaker. I forced myself to stay calm. "What do you mean?" She swallowed. The pregnancy dates." For a moment I couldn't answer. I just stared at her, waiting, hoping she would clarify, hoping she would somehow make everything make sense. Instead, she kept talking, and every sentence made things worse. She said she'd been confused by some of the medical estimates. She said she tried not to think about them. She said she'd convinced herself that dating calculations weren't perfectly accurate. She said she was probably worrying over nothing. The problem wasn't what she said. The problem was what she didn't say. She never actually denied there was a problem. That realization settled over me like ice water. I remember asking a question that took every ounce of courage I had left. "Why would the dates worry you?" The silence afterward felt endless. She looked like someone standing at the edge of a cliff, terrified to move, terrified to stay still. Then she gave an answer that destroyed whatever peace of mind I still possessed. "Because I don't know." I felt my stomach drop. "What don't you know?" Another silence. Longer this time. Then, "I don't know exactly when it happened." The room suddenly felt smaller. The air felt heavier. Every instinct in my body started screaming. But even then, I wasn't ready to accept what seemed obvious. I wanted clarity, specificity, something concrete. Instead, everything remained buried beneath uncertainty. I asked her directly whether there was someone else. Immediately she denied it. Too quickly. Far too quickly. No, the answer arrived before I'd even finished speaking. Then she looked away, and that's when I knew. Not that I knew the full truth, not that I knew every detail, but I knew she wasn't being honest. For the first time in our marriage, I knew it. Over the next week, things deteriorated rapidly. Every conversation felt strained. Every interaction felt artificial. We were two people pretending reality hadn't changed, but reality had changed. The possibility now existed. The possibility that the child I'd already started loving wasn't mine. The possibility that my wife knew more than she was admitting. The possibility that I was living inside a lie. I became obsessed with timelines. Not because I wanted to, because my brain refused to stop. I reviewed calendars, messages, photos, trips, appointments, anything that could establish facts, anything that could separate truth from fear. Then the breakthrough came. Not from my wife, not from some dramatic confession. From information, cold, objective information. While reviewing old records and dates, I realized something undeniable. The earliest medical estimates consistently pointed toward a conception window that aligned almost perfectly with the conference trip. Not with the period my wife and I had always assumed. Not with the timeline she'd repeatedly discussed. That conference, the trip where Daniel had been present, the trip she'd become strangely uncomfortable discussing, the trip she'd spent months minimizing. I stared at the dates for nearly an hour, again and again, looking for mistakes, looking for alternatives, looking for anything. There was nothing. For the first time, biological paternity wasn't just a fear, it was a legitimate possibility supported by evidence. And once I reached that conclusion, another realization followed. If I was finally seeing it, then there was a very real chance my wife had already seen it too, which meant there was only one question left. How much of the truth had she been hiding from me? And I was about to find out in a worst possible way. There is a point where anxiety stops feeling like anxiety and starts feeling like exhaustion. For weeks, I had been running on adrenaline. Every conversation, every memory, every date on a calendar felt like evidence waiting to be interpreted. My mind never stopped. I would wake up thinking about it and fall asleep thinking about it. When I did sleep, I dreamed about hospitals, ultrasounds, and conversations that never seemed to reach a conclusion. But after discovering how closely the conception window aligned with the conference trip, something changed. I wasn't energized by the search anymore. I was tired, profoundly tired, the kind of tired that settles into your bones. I stopped imagining happy futures, stopped browsing baby furniture, stopped reading parenting articles. Every time I tried, a question immediately appeared. What if this isn't my child? That single thought poisoned everything. The nursery became a question mark. The future became a question mark. Even my marriage became a question mark. And the worst part was that I still didn't have certainty, just increasingly impossible odds. My wife noticed the change. Of course she did. You can't live beside someone and not recognize when they're falling apart. One evening she asked if I was okay. The question almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it felt absurd. I wanted to ask if she was okay. I wanted to ask why she kept looking guilty every time pregnancy dates came up. I wanted to ask why she seemed terrified whenever I mentioned the conference. I wanted to ask why I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. Instead, I said, I'm fine. The same lie she'd been giving me for months. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. She looked down immediately. Neither of us spoke after that. At some point during those weeks, I stopped trying to convince myself everything was normal. That stage was over. I wasn't investigating because I was paranoid. I was investigating because reality no longer made sense. There is a difference. A huge difference. One night I drove around for nearly 2 hours after work. No destination, no purpose, just driving. Thinking, trying to understand how I had ended up here. I kept replaying the pregnancy announcement, the baby socks, the tears, the joy, the way I'd held her, the way I'd imagined our future. Every memory now felt contaminated, not destroyed, contaminated, as though a drop of poison had spread backward through time and infected moments that were once pure. I hated myself for feeling that way, because regardless of biology, there was still a baby involved. An innocent child, yet I couldn't stop grieving the life I thought I was building. When I finally arrived home, I found something unexpected. My wife was sitting alone at the kitchen table. No television, no phone, no distractions. Just sitting there, waiting. The moment I walked in, I knew something was different. She looked exhausted, more exhausted than I'd ever seen her. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then she quietly said, "We need to talk." 4 words. Simple words, but I immediately knew. Whatever happened next was going to change everything. I sat down across from her, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. She stared at the table, unable to meet my eyes. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Then she finally looked up, and for the first time since all of this started, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not defensiveness, not irritation, not avoidance. Fear. Pure fear. The kind of fear people feel when they know a secret can no longer stay hidden. And in that moment, before either of us spoke another word, I realized something terrifying. This conversation wasn't going to be about whether there was a problem. It was going to be about how much damage had already been done. Then she opened her mouth and said the first sentence. A sentence that immediately confirmed my worst suspicion. And once those words were spoken, there was no way back. I don't remember breathing. That's the first thing that comes to mind whenever I think about that conversation. Not because I literally stopped. Because every part of my body felt frozen. My wife sat across from me at the kitchen table. The same table where we'd planned baby names. The same table where we'd celebrated the pregnancy. The same table where we'd imagined our future. Now it felt like a courtroom. A place where something was about to be judged and permanently altered. She looked terrified. I looked exhausted. Neither of us looked like the people we'd been a few months earlier. Finally, she spoke. "I think you already know something is wrong." The sentence hit me harder than I expected. Not because it revealed anything new, because it confirmed that all the strange behavior, all the avoidance, all the unanswered questions had never been my imagination. There was something wrong. I stared at her, waiting, hoping, still hoping, somehow. Even after everything. "I need you to be honest," I said. My voice sounded strange, flat, like it belonged to someone else. She nodded, then immediately looked away. That was when I knew honesty wasn't going to come easily. For several minutes the conversation moved in circles. I asked direct questions. She gave incomplete answers. I asked for clarification. She shifted the focus. At one point she actually became frustrated. Not angry, frustrated. As though the conversation itself was unfair. As though my questions were creating the problem rather than her actions. The realization made me feel sick. Then came the first denial. I asked whether there had been someone else. No, immediate, automatic. The same answer she'd given before, but this time I didn't let it pass. I told her about the timeline, the medical estimates, the conference, Daniel, the hidden appointment, the message, everything, one piece after another. I watched her expression change as I spoke. Panic, then resignation, because she realized something. The story she'd been maintaining was no longer sustainable. When I finished, the room became silent. She started crying. At first I felt sympathy, then I felt anger, because I'd spent weeks comforting her while she watched me slowly unravel. And suddenly that anger burst through. Not shouting, not screaming, just honesty. Raw honesty. Tell me the truth. Those 5 words seemed to break something inside her. For a long time she couldn't speak. Then finally she whispered, "There was someone." I remember physically recoiling, not dramatically, just instinctively, like touching something hot. Because despite everything, some part of me had still been hoping she would deny it convincingly, hoping there would be another explanation. There wasn't. The affair had happened during the conference. Not a long relationship, not months of secret meetings. According to her, it was brief, a terrible decision, a mistake. Words that felt meaningless the moment they left her mouth. Because mistakes don't continue for months. Mistakes don't require lies. Mistakes don't involve watching your spouse build a future around a child who may not be his. Then came the part that truly destroyed me. I asked whether she knew who the father was. Immediately she started crying harder, and that was my answer before she even spoke. I wasn't sure. Those 2 words shattered something fundamental inside me, not because of what they meant biologically, because of what they meant emotionally. She had known there was uncertainty. She had known. While I was reading parenting books, while I was planning nurseries, while I was telling my father he would be a grandfather, she had known. Maybe not with certainty, but enough to doubt, enough to hide it, enough to let me keep believing. I felt physically ill. For several minutes I couldn't even process what she was saying. The room seemed distant. Her voice seemed distant. Everything felt unreal. Then she admitted the final truth. She'd been tracking the dates herself, obsessing over them, terrified of what they might mean, terrified that the child wasn't mine, terrified that eventually I'd realize it too, which meant every confusing reaction, every defensive answer, every avoided conversation, every strange expression, every lie, had been connected to the same secret. And suddenly the entire pregnancy looked different, not like a shared journey, like a countdown toward the moment her deception finally collapsed. When the conversation ended, it was nearly 3 in the morning. Neither of us had any tears left. Neither of us had any energy left. The truth was finally out. But one devastating question still remained unanswered. Because despite her confession, despite the affair, despite everything I had learned, there was still no definitive proof about the child. And the answer to that final question was coming sooner than either of us wanted. The paternity test happened 3 weeks later. Those were the longest 3 weeks of my life. People talk about waiting for life-changing news as though it's a passive experience. Is it? Waiting becomes its own kind of suffering. You wake up with it, carry it through the day, bring it to bed at night. Every thought eventually circles back to the same place. Every possibility becomes a future you're forced to imagine. Part of me hoped the test would prove I was the father. Not because it would erase the affair. Nothing could erase that. But at least it would save one piece of the future I'd been grieving. Another part of me feared exactly the opposite. Because by then, I wasn't just questioning biology. I was questioning everything. The marriage, the trust, the person I thought I knew. My wife and I barely spoke during those weeks. We existed in the same house, but it felt like we occupied different worlds. The silence wasn't hostile. It was exhausted. There are only so many times 2 people can discuss betrayal before words stop functioning. Most conversations became practical. Appointments, schedules. Nothing deeper, nothing emotional. The emotional part had already burned itself out. When the results finally arrived, I was alone. I had deliberately arranged it that way. I didn't want an audience. I didn't want explanations. I didn't want apologies. I wanted the truth. Just the truth. Nothing else. I remember staring at the email for several minutes before opening it. My hands were shaking. My chest hurt. Every possible future seemed compressed into a single click. Then I opened it, and there it was. One sentence. Clear. Clinical. Absolute. I was not the biological father. No ambiguity. No room for interpretation. No hope hidden between the lines. Just certainty. For a long time, I sat there without moving. No dramatic reaction. No shouting. No tears. Just silence. The strange thing about devastating news is that sometimes it arrives after you've already spent months mourning. The shock had happened gradually. The grief had happened gradually. The collapse had happened gradually. The test simply ended the argument. It transformed fear into fact. That's all. Later that evening, I told my wife I knew. She cried. Apologized. Told me she never wanted any of this to happen. And for the first time, I realized something important. I believed her, not because I trusted her, that trust was gone. But because regret and honesty are not the same thing, I genuinely think she regretted what she'd done. I genuinely think she hated the damage she'd caused. None of that changed the outcome. Regret cannot rebuild trust by itself. Some things break too completely. A few weeks later, I moved into a small apartment. Nothing dramatic. No screaming matches. No revenge. No attempts to destroy each other. Just paperwork. Boxes. Signatures. The quiet dismantling of a life we'd spent years building. People often ask whether anger was the hardest part. It wasn't. Anger eventually burns out. What remained was grief. Grief for a future that no longer existed. Grief for the child I thought was mine. Grief for the marriage I thought I had. Grief for the version of myself who believed certainty was permanent. The healing wasn't sudden. It still isn't. Some days are harder than others. Some memories still hurt. Certain songs, certain restaurants, certain dates on the calendar. But gradually, something unexpected happened. The pain stopped defining every hour of my day. Then every day. Then every week. Life didn't return to what it was before. It couldn't, but it became something survivable. Something real. Something mine. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that acceptance doesn't mean approving of what happened. It doesn't mean forgiving everything. It doesn't mean pretending the damage wasn't real. Acceptance simply means recognizing reality as it is and choosing to keep moving forward anyway. The child wasn't mine. The marriage didn't survive. The future I imagined disappeared. Those facts never changed. What changed was me. I stopped measuring my worth by someone else's betrayal. I stopped treating her choices as a reflection of my value. I stopped asking why I wasn't enough. Because eventually, I realized the question itself was wrong. Her decisions belonged to her. My recovery belonged to me. And for the first time since that day with the baby socks, I began building a future again. Not the future I planned. Not the future I wanted. But a future that was honest. After everything that happened, that turned out to matter more than I ever understood. And that's where my story is now. Not at a happy ending. Not at a tragic ending. Just at a beginning I never expected to need. One honest step at a time. This is the end of the story. Don't forget to share with your friends, comment, like, and subscribe.